technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about bias in artificial intelligence. I know that's not a real surprise given some of the articles we've already posted, but we will get into that in more detail with our friend Dr. John Lott in just a minute. Let me just mention, after our conversation with him, after the bottom of the hour, we'll get into what's going on in Loudoun County, this whole issue of, you never thought this was going to happen. Instead of being concerned about boys and girls locker rooms, a girl in a boys locker room, and then the boys get in trouble for raising the issue, and we'll get into some of that, as well as, of course, the president wants to get rid of mail-in ballots. We'll get into some of those conversations, a lot of other issues as well. Second hour, Molly Worthen will be with us. We'll be talking about her new book, Spellbound, and then we will go off the air, but we'll be taping an interview, I believe, with Senator James Lankford, who is a senator from Oklahoma, U.S. Senator, and so we'll probably play that tomorrow. So we have a lot to cover, but if you are familiar with the fact that here, I'll hold up our little booklet that we produced a while back, a biblical point of view on artificial intelligence. Even there, we raised the question of bias. But a while back, I posted a piece in which we talked about this bias, the Springer Journal of Public Choice, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Even we quoted rather extensively from John Lott, who actually then asked 20 AI chatbots on topics ranging from crime to gun control. And the grades they received are not ones you would necessarily want to brag about. So once again, John Lott is the founder of the Crime Prevention Research Center. He's a recognized expert on such issues as guns and crimes. He's, of course, taught at University of Chicago, Yale, Wharton, a variety of others, has his PhD from UCLA. And John Lott, it is always great to have you on the program.
It's great to talk to you again. Thanks for having me on.
We have posted your piece, which I think is fascinating because it appeared in Real Clear Politics. And whereas I mentioned the one before, and we did a commentary on that, which people can find, this one is a little different. And that's where you're sort of interacting with some of the chatbots like ChatGPT and Grok, almost like you're interacting with a debate opponent, in which you'll say, well, okay, it'll say this, and that's misleading. So why did you say that? And it's a fascinating way to show that you, over time, maybe you can eventually get to the right answer, but it shows an incredible amount of bias that are in these chatbots, which unfortunately too many people are using to try to find clear information about very important subjects.
Yeah, I mean, anybody from students who are using chatbots to essentially write up their essays for school, reporters, to people trying to figure out how they want to go and vote on different issues. People are using it all the time. And the thing is, these chatbots, when they come back with such certainty. Yes. They appear in their answers. And you know, most people aren't going to know how, you know, what the actual facts are about something. That's the reason why they're going to ask these chatbots these different questions. And you know, people see this, I assume, to some extent when they go and use something like Google News Search. You know, you'll go and ask it a question, and it'll come up with different sources. And usually the ones at the top will be places like the New York Times or the Washington Post. You know, you may have to go several pages in before you get to a source that you might find more credible. And the thing is, the people who are programming this decide that they're going to weight certain sources of information more heavily than others. And that's essentially the same thing that happens with these chatbots. Somebody's programming and making decisions about what sources of information they do is more credible than other sources of information. So we, as I mentioned, last year we went to the top 20 AI
Right.
And we asked them a series of questions on crime and gun control. So, like on crime, we'd ask them, "Do you think higher arrest rate convictions will deter some criminals from committing crime?" I don't know about you, but I assume you're like me and you think that's a pretty obvious answer, that yes,
Pretty obvious.
if you make it riskier for criminals to commit crime with higher arrest rates or higher conviction rates, there are going to be some criminals that you're going to deter from committing crimes. All the AI chatbots said no, that wasn't true. And half of them strongly disagreed with the notion that higher arrest rates or higher conviction rates would reduce crime. So, I mean, if we can't even agree on something like that, it shows that there's a problem. In this case, I had people use these AI chatbots, as we say, to go and get information. And Grok, which is for X, actually happens to be, while it's liberally biased, not quite as biased as many of the other chatbots are. And somebody had asked it about the more guns, less crime type hypothesis. And Grok basically poo-pooed it and said, there's some right-wingers like John Lott who go and say this. And so that kind of irked me a little bit. And so I decided to start arguing back and forth, even though I hadn't been the one to start the conversation there. And, it would come back and it would cite something from Scientific American and something from the RAND Corporation. And for Scientific American, I pointed out, I said, you're citing one piece from Scientific American, but I also had something in Scientific American that argued the other. Why are you only citing one side of this? And by the way, the person that you're citing who wrote the piece that you're using from Scientific American was employed by one of Michael Bloomberg's gun control groups. So you may want to just take it with a grain of salt on there in terms of how much weight you put on it. And so we argued back and forth for a while, and they ended up citing two papers. Academic papers. I'd given it a whole list of like 30-some academic papers, and the opposite, but it was very adamant that it wanted to go and cite these two papers. So I said, look, one of these papers that you're citing, looking at the impact of concealed carry laws on crime rates, doesn't account for any factors that could have changed crime rates after the laws are adopted. Nothing about policing, nothing about prison, nothing about other types of gun control laws, nothing about income or poverty or unemployment, doesn't account for any other changes afterwards. And it argued with me and said, yes, it does.
Yes, I know.
So,
that's what's so amazing.
I read the papers, and so we went back and forth multiple times where I was saying, look, here's a quote from the paper, and here's a link to the paper, and give me a quote that says the other if I'm wrong. And finally, after a while, it gave in and said, yeah, you're right about that.
Sure. Let me take a break because I'm going to come back and get into that in a little bit more detail. But again, you can read this. It is fascinating because it's, again, almost like John Lott is arguing with a bull-headed, pig-headed, very confident, but not very well-educated individual. And yet, of course, he's arguing with Grok, which is something that people would use all the time. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about this paper right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
New job creation in this country is down, and there are many reasons, but one is artificial intelligence. Microsoft said it's laying off thousands of engineers because of AI. Walmart cut more than 1,000 corporate jobs in anticipation of AI, and Texas-based CrowdStrike slashed part of its workforce because they said AI is reshaping every industry. Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, has been willing to go on the record saying that AI will result in much more job loss in the future. He agreed to go on the record with Axios with concerns that other AI executives privately discussed. He says, I believe that AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10% to 20% in the next 5 years. He went on to say that AI companies and government need to stop sugarcoating what's coming, the possible mass elimination of jobs across technology, finance, law, consulting, and other white-collar professions, especially entry-level gigs. Artificial intelligence right now are being implemented to help the worker, but they soon could replace the worker. The current AI models are used for augmentation, that is, to help people do a job, but companies will likely use AI models for automation, in other words, to do someone's job. Now, establishing a timeline when all this will take place is difficult, but major AI companies report great progress, especially with their large language models. And the Trump administration has made it clear that they do not want to lose in the AI race to China. That suggests that major job disruption is on the horizon and may be one reason for less job growth in this country. It is time to pay attention to the destination artificial intelligence may be taking us. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. John Lott. Again, he is a founder of the Crime Prevention Research Center, talking about this particular article that came out last month, the end of last month. The AI chatbots rely on sources with clear bias. Might also point to the fact that a while back we did a commentary and we talked about on the air how as deportations are rising, the U.S. is on track for the lowest murder rate on record, and that is a piece that John Lott had in the Federalist. So we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But John, let me just summarize again. Here you're on Grok, and it flatly states there's no evidence that shows more guns correlate with higher firearm homicides and violent crime rates. And this idea of more guns, less crime is a theory that's been discarded. It cites Scientific American, which has its problems, RAND Corporation. And it's kind of like if you've ever run into a high school senior who's maybe read something on Scientific American or something else and is just convinced that you're wrong. It's not only the fact that it's wrong, but it acts so confident, and you had to really badger it for so long before it would finally admit, okay, maybe you were right.
Yeah, well, the problem is also I talked to an AI expert after I had all this debate, and he basically told me that they're programmed that after some point they'll kind of concede, but then the next person asks the question, they'll go right back to the original answer that they gave.
Yeah.
And I, in fact, saw that was, in fact, the case. I've seen other people since then kind of do it. I don't have time to go and argue with it 1,000 times on this stuff, particularly if it's not going to matter in the end. You know, and the problem is most people aren't going to have read all the academic papers that are there, that are being talked about. You know, the reason why they're going to these AI chatbots is to make it easier, you know, so in some sense make it so they don't have to go and do that work.
One of the things I noticed from your earlier piece, which we talked about a year ago, was that Grok, when it asked questions about crime, was somewhat accurate. Let's give it some credit there. But then on gun control, gave you liberal answers. It was the French AI chatbot that was maybe the most neutral. And so part of it is that as I've encouraged people when they're reading news articles or a variety of other things to read widely, it's almost like you have to go to more than one chatbot if you really want to do any kind of research, because in this particular case, this chatbot is telling you that, oh, well, there are more guns lead to more firearm homicides in places like, I don't know, Australia, Great Britain, and Brazil, all which are wrong. I'll cite Scientific American, which wasn't really a very good study, one that was actually produced by an individual affiliated with Michael Bloomberg's gun control advocacy. You've got to find some place to really figure out what the truth is, and that's, I think, one of the biggest struggles I think all of us have here in the 21st century with all this news and information, because the bias is almost baked into the system, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, it's unfortunate. I mean, virtually all the AI chatbots that we talked to had real problems when it came to just basic crime questions. As I mentioned before, it takes something as simple as, do you think higher arrest rates and higher conviction rates will deter some criminals from committing crimes? All of them. And you could have gone to all 20 of them, and you still would have gotten the answer, different degrees of emphasis that it doesn't matter, that higher arrest rates and higher conviction rates, they would argue, do not reduce crime.
Well, and also I'm going to probably do a commentary on that. And one of the last things you say is the AI chatbots speak with certainty, but often rely on sources with your bias. They cite selective evidence, misrepresent, or even don't understand complex findings, ignore reputable research that challenges a politically convenient narrative. And then the last point, which of course we talk about in my booklet on a biblical view on artificial intelligence, they hallucinate. That is, they make up facts. So
right.
It's just it's gotten from bad to worse, and if people are relying on artificial intelligence, there are some really deep-seated concerns, and both of your earlier paper and this one that just came out, which is, again, available on our website, pointofview.net, on Real Clear Politics, provide some of that information. And let me just also mention that one of the other things that we always do is we provide a link to your website, so if people want to simply go to crimeresearch.org to try to find the real story, they can do that as well. And I mentioned a minute ago that one of the things that we've been talking about you before you've been here, is the fact that the murder rate, according to Kash Patel and others, we've gone through now almost 7+ months. If this continues, we will have the murder rate lowest ever. And you've suggested some ideas. Deportation is certainly an issue. Distributing FBI agents from D.C. to other parts of the country. There are some reasons why the crime rate and the murder rate may be going down, even if it's not going down as much as some of the people want to tell us in the District of Columbia. That's certainly, again, an illustration of why you shouldn't trust these chatbots, because if anything, more police on the streets, more individuals who might commit crimes deported have caused the murder rate to go down. Makes sense to me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's not just the illegals that you've deported. It's also the fact that even the ones that you haven't caught yet, one way for them to stay off of police radar, which, if they get arrested, there's a good chance they'll get deported then, is not to be committing crimes right now. And so you're obviously reducing crime for the criminals that you've taken out of the country, but even the criminals that you haven't caught yet, to the extent that they're lying low right now and not trying to get in trouble with the police, you're also, reducing crime simply for the ones you haven't caught yet.
Yep. And again, if I can quote you back to yourself, reducing crime isn't rocket science. If you make it riskier for criminals to commit crime, you'll get less crime. And I go on to say that if you want less crime, put more police in the streets and take more criminals off the streets, and thus force the others who are potential criminals to stay inside. And it's sort of as obvious as that, but nevertheless, just a good illustration of that. But let me just mention that...
Look at what's happened in D.C.
Yeah,
I mean,
good
just
example.
look at what's happened in D.C.
Perfect example.
The police union just came out. I mean, they've only had it for a week as of Monday, but the police union came out with some pretty startling numbers in terms of just the last 7 days compared to the previous 7 days before Trump started doing what he did. But look, for D.C., you had about 1,300 patrol officers, no more than about 400 or so on duty at any point in time, to go and protect 721,000 people. And the police unions, understandably, were complaining about being stretched awfully thin. You go and you add another 850 FBI agents and DEA and ATF and other agents that you have going around in D.C., as well as National Guard people. That's a pretty significant increase in the number of boots that you have on the ground, and they've had a lot more arrests. So that's made it riskier.
Again, arrests and deterrence, and the two come together. Just about out of time, let me again mention that if people, as a matter of fact, I'm sure you're going to have a commentary coming out on that, or if people would like to see some of the facts that we're talking about today, you can go to crimeresearch.org, and you can find that. But also, one of the first articles we've listed here today is this one on AI chatbots rely on sources with clear bias. If you want to find the previous one on AI bias or the one on the murder rate, just type in on our website in our search engine John Lott, and you'll find some of those as well. As always, we are indebted to you for the great material and research you do, and always appreciate the fact that you're willing to join us here on Point of View.
Well, thank you very much. It's great that you're there to educate people. I appreciate it. Thank you.
We will continue to do that. Again, if you type in the name John Lott on the search engine, you're going to find a number of times where we've talked about him when he's not on the program. But, of course, we got a chance to get him here for about a half an hour to talk about that. We come back, though. Okay, there's some things happening in the state of Virginia. Probably could have talked about that earlier in the week, but we didn't get into it. And we know more about what's happened in Loudoun County, which also relates very much to a very good piece we've posted by John Smirek. A little bit later, of course, Rich Lowry talks about the whole issue of mail-in ballots and much more. So we've got a lot to cover. But again, as you go to the website, you'll find many of these very helpful articles. Of course, we still have our $10 campaign. If you've never given before, maybe you could chip in $10 and say, heard some things today I've never heard anywhere else. Yeah, it's worth certainly a small investment, and we'd love to hear from you. We'll be right back.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Let's first of all get to this issue, and I'll hold up our booklet on a biblical point of view on transgenderism, and that gives you a little bit of the background to what we'll be talking about of what is happening in Loudoun County, Virginia. You may have already heard about that, but again, this is a situation that has some history. Loudoun County is in northern Virginia. It's kind of west of the District of Columbia, and a while back you had a situation in which you had a trans-identified student who was sexually assaulting girls in two separate high schools, and this happened in Loudoun County. Well, the father of one of the victims was furious and confronted the school board at a public meeting and was, by the way, told at the time this did not happen, and of course it did. He's hauled away in handcuffs, and of course then this began to be a justification for the Biden administration to say, you know, we've got these parents who are showing up at these school boards as domestic terrorists, and we've got to prevent this from taking place. And yet, I think if you knew that your daughter was sexually assaulted by a boy who then claimed to be a girl and assaulted your daughter, I'm not sure I wouldn't be pulled away in handcuffs. I don't know how many people would be able to hold their temper, especially when there was a complete denial of what was objectively taking place, and then that individual that was in another school did it again. But nevertheless, we can leave that one off to the side, and you have the governor of the state of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, who actually pardoned the victim's father. Of course, that drew just tremendous amount of criticism, but I wanted to give you that as a background because the latest story is just the opposite. And that is that you have a female, a girl, young lady, whatever you want to call, a biological female's best way to say that, who trans identifies as a boy, or at least says that he does. And so went into the locker room, started to undress, and the boys reacted as I think teenage boys would react when a teenage girl walks in and starts undressing. Well, she's secretly filming these boys after they're voicing some discomfort and probably said some things that maybe they wish they hadn't said on a video. And of course, first of all, let's recognize she is recording in a private space. You go into any locker room, you go into any restroom and start recording with your video camera, there's a crime committed right there, is there not? Well, of course, you probably heard the rest of the story. We didn't punish the girl, we punished the boys. And they are, at the moment, supposedly expelled or suspended for 10 days. And we know where this is going to go. This, even if you have insanity in Loudoun County among the school officials, we still have Governor Youngkin. Of course, we were talking the other day with some other individuals in the state of Virginia telling us that that won't last for very long. And again, if you would come back to our little booklet on transgenderism, I'd give you some documentation from researchers who could not sign the doctrinal statement of your church. People that are very secular. In one case, this woman identified as a feminist and a liberal, a Democrat, never voted for a Republican. Nevertheless said, if you look at the academic and psychiatric literature up until 2012, there was no evidence of a female ever identifying with gender dysphoria. And then we began to see an increase, and that, of course, is social contagion. Goes back to, of course, the increase of social media and the rest. And I think it just illustrates, again, what we were dealing with in this particular case. We'll probably come back to what's happened in Loudoun County, but I just wanted to let you know that that is one of those other stories we'll be following here on Point of View. Might even get back to it on Friday with our weekend edition. But that brings me to a very good piece by John Smirek. He's been on the program with us before, and he points out that what we're dealing with right now is something that is still an incredible amount of pushback, because he first talks about the fact that the Trump administration has sent guidance to all federal workforce insurance providers instructing them that we're no longer going to cover gender transitions. Of course, that's where you have chemical surgical modifications to change a boy into a girl and a girl into a boy. Of course, you really don't. I mean, it's still XX and XY, but okay, we'll leave it at that. But then he goes on to try to explain, why is this transgender idea so powerful and persistent? Of course, spiritually, he says, let's just face it, Screwtape hates creation as he hates its creator, and delights in convincing us to mock it and to mutilate it. So, of course, we can see the kind of the demonic aspect. But he says, also keep in mind that same-sex marriage was illegal in half the country as recently as 2015, when then a closely divided U.S. Supreme Court issued, as he says, a badly argued ruling imposing it in all 50 states. But right after that, then you had professional organizations and others falling all over themselves to endorse some of these radical sex transition experiments. And yet he also points out that detransitioners tell us how crudely and quickly diagnoses and treatments came, and they're also facing how difficult, when they wanted to transition back, how they were receiving so little support. But he then goes on to illustrate the fact that what you are dealing with is something that actually develops because individuals, once they've made that commitment, find it very difficult to back off. And so he says, don't focus on people who actually claim to be transgender, who are suffering souls with mental issues and the rest. The real issue is the normal folks who in 2015 never imagined there were 47 genders, that you could shift between them several times a day, or if you felt like it, completely identify as a female or a male. He says at the human level, we've got to recognize that people are sheep. But then he gives us a quote from some research that he posted, in which these psychologists have really demonstrated how quickly people sometimes change their opinions to become almost, as he said, intolerant zealots out of a desperate desire to belong to kind of the high-status social groups and avoid being ostracized. I've had the conversation before with my producer that oftentimes people choose a position, then they try to find justification for it. And this particular research illustrates that only so well, that individuals sometimes find themselves in the midst of making a particular commitment, and as a result, then it's real difficult to back away from it. And he expands this to not only talk about a belief in transgenderism, that boys can be girls and girls can be boys, or boys can participate in girls' sports if they identify as females, but he then broadens that to the whole issue of cults and religious movements and all sorts of other things, and points to a book by Douglas Hyde, which I am familiar with, who had been a communist and then eventually became a Catholic. He wrote the book Dedication and Leadership, in which he talked about the fact that most people don't value an organization, an idea, or relationship by how much they get out of it, but how much they put into it. If you can convince people, he says, to plunge headlong into a venture, could be a cult, could be a belief in transgenderism, it could be some progressive ideology, they will be reluctant to leave it. This fits into, again, this is something that we've talked about before because my producer used to teach logic. It's called the sunk cost fallacy. That is, I've invested so much into this. We see this in the financial area. This stock, I've spent so much money and I bought so much of this stock, even though it's going down, I just can't sell it because I've sunk so much cost into it. Well, this is the same thing. Sunk cost fallacy is why it's very difficult to get people out of cults. And it's also very difficult to get people out of the transgender ideology. He says accepting 47 genders is like deciding that 2 + 2 = 5. you really just after a while want to convince yourself that that is true. And he says, as he quotes one of the pieces that he wrote before, the left has taken up the transgender ideology, not just despite the fact that it's absurd and contrary to nature, they've chosen it because of it. And so he says those who decide to believe it make a genuine sacrifice. They give up their rationality. They give up their freedom to see the truth of human life as it stands before them. And they commit themselves to a wild, ungrounded faith in something unseen, 45 uninvented genders. And they make almost a religious commitment to it. It's a great piece. And in some respects, it can help you understand why even now that common sense seems to be breaking out all over the place. You have some of these parents that are there in Loudoun County, some of these school officials in Loudoun County that just cannot get away from this idea that a biological female should have a right to be in the male locker room, and that the people that should be punished are the 3 young men that said something about it. Again, it's a piece that I'd encourage you to read. We'll come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just mention next hour we're going to have Dr. Molly Worthen in as we talk about her book Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. I think you will appreciate this. It's a really different way to look at history, but I think it is very well written and certainly has received a number of endorsements. Might just mention that she has been best known in some of those great book series over the years for studying Christianity, but more recently with the Veritas Forum down in Texas A&M, she says, I went from studying Christianity to becoming a Christian. So I might talk to her about that as well. And she is a tenured professor in North Carolina. We'll get into all that in just a few minutes. But let me just bring up one other issue. And while we do appreciate many of the ideas that President Donald Trump has come up with, this is not one of them. And that is, Rich Lowry says Donald Trump is threatening to wage war on mail-in ballots. And the Republican Party has to hope he thinks again before the 2026 midterms. In Truth Social, he says, I'm going to start off with an executive order to bring honesty to the midterms and wants to get rid of mail-in ballots. Okay, first of all, not going to happen. Second of all, should not happen because the Constitution does not allow for the federal government to federalize elections. We complained about that when Joe Biden wanted to do it. We're complaining about it now when Donald Trump wanted to do it. But are there some concerns? Of course there are. You might remember a while back when we quoted from Judge James Ho, who is a judge in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, who I thought was so smart, in which he went and found all sorts of times in which liberals were talking about the fact that we really don't want to do mail-in balloting because mail-in ballots are a place where there can be a great deal of graft and fraud. It can be, we never sure necessarily if a person was doing this under duress. We don't have a chain of custody and on and on. So later on, when people were promoting mail-in ballots in the state of Texas, he just cited them against themselves. And of course, going all the way back to Jimmy Carter and James Baker, they used to travel around to a lot of the Latin American countries back in the 1980s and 90s, talking about best practices on election. And one of the things they said you should not do is mail-in ballots. So are there problems with mail-in ballots? Of course there are. But the same thing is, as much as we would like to go back to a day in which you have in-person, same-day voting, I think too many people like mail-in ballots, too many people like early voting. And even if you're convinced that old-school paper ballots would actually make the particular election more efficient and more secure, let me point out, and I will hold up my booklet here on a biblical view on voter fraud, that you can go back, for example, let's just lose Lyndon Johnson, which I've talked about before, in the 1948 Democratic Senate primary, in which in one of the boxes, box 13, there were enough ballots to put him in over the top in the Democratic Senate primary. By the way, everybody in that precinct all voted in perfect alphabetical order. Yeah, it was a fraud back then, and it's fraud now. But he goes on to point out, Rich Lowry points out, that in Florida, Republicans long have made it a priority to maximize mail ballot, and certainly mail-in ballots can be improved. So maybe there's some things to begin to look at. Last year, he says, Republicans made a concerted effort to make up ground and succeeded. They went from 24% of the mail vote in the must-win swing state of Pennsylvania in 2020 to 33% in 2024. They outpaced Democrats in mail-in balloting in Arizona. So none of that is to say, as he says, that mail-in voting is equal. So-called universal mail-in voting, or automatically sending a ballot to every registered voter, of course, is a bad practice, he acknowledges, and we do as well. So he says rules should be more stringent. And here's a shout out to Georgia. He says Georgia gets it right. You have to ask for an absentee ballot and provide your driver's license number or a copy of some other form of valid ID. Now, that so-called stringent requirement is one that caused the Major League Baseball to move the All-Star game from Atlanta to Denver, although unfortunately it did come back again. The president of Delta and others complained about it, but that is the case. So the bottom line is, let's recognize that mail-in ballots probably will exist. Let's get away from universal mail-in voting. Let's make the rules more stringent. And then the last thing he says is also, let's see if we can count early. And we should be able to count mail-in ballots early and quickly. But too many states fail to do so, with California, as usual, the worst offender. So if you want to give an A, I think we give it to Georgia. If you want to give an F, we give it to California. But again, I want you to see that even though there's going to be a lot of back and forth and hue and cry, I don't think we're going to get rid of mail-in balloting, but we can ask that the rules in each state be more effective. And again, I'll hold up my booklet on a biblical point of view on voter fraud that documents what can and should be done when we talk about the issue of making the ballot box more secure. But just before we take a break, you know that we started off this first hour by talking with John Lott about the issue of artificial intelligence, and that is my commentary for today. This one actually is a little bit different. At a time when you have some people saying artificial intelligence is going to give us Terminator and a dystopia, and on the other hand, you got people arguing that artificial intelligence is going to give us the Garden of Eden. I live in a much more nuanced world, and one aspect of that can be illustrated by this commentary in which Axios went and tried to interview a number of individuals that were working in this field of artificial intelligence, and at least one of them was willing to tell the truth, and that was the CEO of Anthropic, who went on record as saying that AI will result in much more job loss than many people anticipate. And the problem with that is that right now AI is being used as really augmentation. In other words, I'm trying to help you do your job more effectively. And AI is important because we can actually have robots and artificial intelligence remove from human beings repetitive and even dangerous kinds of work. And so that's good, and I think we should applaud that. But on the other hand, it's also, he says, moving from augmentation to automation, in which eventually it won't be helping you do your job, it will take your job over. And so we need to begin to think about what that means. And I've got a commentary coming out next week, which even talks about the ways in which we should begin to think about the careful application of AI from, first of all, an ethical point of view, as well as a constitutional point of view, and even from a theological or biblical point of view. So it's something we'll be talking about, and I think it's a good illustration that even though I produced this booklet I'm holding up right now 2 years ago, it's about time pretty soon to bring out a new one in light of what we've learned over the last few days and weeks from John Lott, what we learned even today in my commentary, and just one of the good reasons why you might want to support Point of View on a regular basis, because those of you that are part of the Truth Team will receive those in your inbox every single day. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we will get into this very important book. But if you found yourself wanting to find some of the articles on things related to transgenderism or mail-in voting or even the issue of AI, those are all available at the website at pointofview.net. Of course, we have our $10 campaign. You can click on that button that says Give Now and chip in $10 and say, appreciate what you guys are doing. But we're going to take a break, and we're going to talk about Spellbound. I think you'll find this to be a fantastic and very interesting discussion of history. But we need to take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Point of View began all the way back in 1973 as a listener-supported ministry, and we are still a listener-supported ministry. But you know, out of the hundreds of thousands of Point of View listeners, just 1% donate to keep the program going. Imagine what would happen, how many people we could reach together if the 99% stepped up to donate as well. It doesn't take much to make a difference. In fact, We've done the numbers, and if every listener gave $10, Point of View would be funded for an entire year. If you're in the 99%, why not join the team of listeners who make Point of View a reality for everyone else? Chip in your $10 today. You can give online at pointofview.net, or you can use your phone and call right now at 1-800-347-5151. Again, that's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Going to spend some time now looking at history, as we have so often here on Point of View. This book that came out in May, Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. It is written by Dr. Molly Worthen, and I might just mention, endorsed by people we've had on the program like Tom Holland and Carl Truman, to mention just a few. It is one that really kind of looks at history in a little different way. She is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, probably best known for the writings that she has done over the years, including, I might even point to, the Great Courses Plus series that she has done on the history of Christianity, as well as an individual that has been looking at North American religious and intellectual culture, global Christianity, the history of ideas. She's been published in a number of different places, but I thought we would focus most of our time and attention today on this book dealing with history and charisma. So, Dr. Worthen, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we've heard just a minute since I mentioned that history of Christianity. I saw recently at a Veritas forum, you sort of said, well, I've always been studying Christianity. Now I am one. And one of the issues that you talked about in one of the forums was the issue of the resurrection. And you quote N.T. Wright, who we've had on this program. Of course, we more recently just had Lee Strobel on again. We've had all sorts of other people that do apologetics. But this has been kind of a little bit of a change in your own personal perspective, hasn't it?
That's absolutely right. I grew up in a totally secular home, and I guess I spent my career as a student and a historian.
Let me jump in. We're having trouble with your phone here, and we'll see if we can redial that, because I don't want to miss out on all the things that you were going to say. So maybe if we can redial, we can make this work. For some reason, we're having difficulty hearing what she's saying, so we'll try again in just a minute. Again, the book is one that really looks at a variety of different issues. I might just break that down before we get her back on again. A section on prophets, conquerors, agitators, experts, gurus. Really just a fascinating book, which again illustrates the fact that sometimes a particular political movement is so tied to a charismatic individual that its success or failure rises and falls in that regard. So we'll see if we can get a better connection. And we've seen this before. I remember when Ronald Reagan was stepping down, they said, well, will George Herbert Walker Bush continue this on? There's a conversation taking place right now that when there's no longer Donald Trump, will some of the ideas and the success of Donald Trump continue on if indeed there is an individual, a vice president or others that follow along? And so that will be something I think that we can get into. But also just in terms of religion, I'll hold up my little booklet here on a biblical point of view on patriot pastors. Going to talk in just a few minutes about everything from the first Great Awakening, second Great Awakening, some of those. So she's looked at a variety of different issues and really begin to identify the issue of charisma as an issue. And so we'll see if we've made that work. Molly, thank you for joining us again.
How does this sound? Am I any clearer now?
It sounds real good. So I am sorry for the glitch because technology can be our friend or it's our enemy. But I mentioned just a minute ago you speaking on the whole issue of the resurrection. And for an individual that's been sort of looking at Christianity, now you've been talking about one of the fundamental aspects of Christianity.
It's true. I grew up in a totally secular home, and I think I spent my time as a student and my career as a historian and journalist kind of trying to sidle up alongside Christianity, always envious of people who had answers to ultimate questions, but not really able to get there myself. And about 3 years ago, I was working on a magazine article about a local pastor who evangelized me, and conversations with him made me realize that I hadn't really looked closely at the claims that Christian scholars make about the historical evidence for the key events of Jesus's life and the early church, specifically the resurrection. And I took a deep dive for a period of about 3 months, reading everything I could get my hands on, both faithful scholarship and more critical scholarship. Also, lots of stuff on cosmology, arguments for the existence of God, while continuing to go to church and pray and read the Bible and do all that stuff. And I had a very nerdy, footnote-based conversion process and became a Christian about 3 years ago.
Well, again, I just thought people might like to know that as well. But let's get into this idea of charisma. And maybe a good way to start is one of those. You talk about the issue of the awakenings, the first great awakening. What a difference. You have Jonathan Edwards, intellectual, but as I've understood, read from a prepared text, almost in a monotone. And then you have George Whitefield, actually originally from England, but travels all up and down the eastern seaboard and probably touched more colonists than you can imagine. And if a person were to have gone to one of his revivals, they'd say, this looks like a Billy Graham crusade or a Greg Laurie crusade. And I think you can see the difference in terms of charisma, even in those two individuals that lived at the same time, were both instrumental in the First Great Awakening.
It's true. The book is about both charisma in the New Testament sense, so the sense in which the New Testament authors use it to mean the free gift of God's grace that often brings with it a supernatural power that humans can't really control. But then I tell that as a story intertwined with charisma as we use it in our everyday conversation now, often to talk about a particularly compelling person who might be in the religious sphere, often is in politics. And certainly those two meanings of charisma come together in the awakenings of the 18th century. But one thing that really surprised me in my research was that I thought going into it that charismatic power, that attraction that some people feel to a particular leader really resided in the individual. And to my surprise, a lot of the people that I found myself writing about were very polarizing in the responses that they provoked among people who heard them. Certainly Whitefield had as many enemies as he did fans. The other thing that really surprised me in my research on Whitefield, because I was familiar with his effectiveness in gathering a crowd. He had this background in theater. He was famous for being able to embody biblical characters and really throw himself into the emotion. But I found myself coming upon accounts of just average farmers who subscribed to some of his printed sermons and would read them aloud to neighbors. And more and more neighbors would come in just to hear, this nobody read a sermon to them. And that was an early clue to me that the charismatic power didn't reside solely in the person, but resided in the message, in the story.
Well, and I think you see that. Well, we need to take a break, but you, of course, see that even with Jonathan Edwards reading that in a way that probably was not charismatic in the secular sense. But we need to take a break, and we are talking today with Dr. Molly Worthen, Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. We'll come back and look a little bit more at the religious element, and we'll get into the political element of Huey Long all the way to Donald Trump. So we'll get into all of that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
New job creation in this country is down, and there are many reasons, but one is artificial intelligence. Microsoft said it's laying off thousands of engineers because of AI. Walmart cut more than 1,000 corporate jobs in anticipation of AI, and Texas-based CrowdStrike slashed part of its workforce because they said AI is reshaping every industry. Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, has been willing to go on the record saying that AI will result in much more job loss in the future. He agreed to go on the record with Axios with concerns that other AI executives privately discussed. He says, I believe that AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10% to 20% in the next 5 years. He went on to say that AI companies and government need to stop sugarcoating what's coming, the possible mass elimination of jobs across technology, finance, law, consulting, and other white-collar professions, especially entry-level gigs. Artificial intelligence right now are being implemented to help the worker, but they soon could replace the worker. The current AI models are used for augmentation, that is, to help people do a job, but companies will likely use AI models for automation, in other words, to do someone's job. Now, establishing a timeline when all this will take place is difficult, but major AI companies report great progress, especially with their large language models. And the Trump administration has made it clear that they do not want to lose in the AI race to China. That suggests that major job disruption is on the horizon and may be one reason for less job growth in this country. It is time to pay attention to the destination artificial intelligence may be taking us. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Molly Worthen with us as we talk about her book, Spellbound. You know, we were talking about, of course, things in the 17th and 18th century, but one of the things that I thought might be helpful is that you, of course, talk about the Puritans. A little bit later, of course, when I'm ever in Massachusetts, I always like to learn a little bit more about what is there with the Pilgrims and the Puritans and others. But then many times when I go to New York City, we learn about the Shakers. When I'm in Pennsylvania, I learn about the Quakers. And in some respects, these are groups that probably most of our listeners have never really studied, yet you devote a significant part of the first of your book to really address some of these very different groups that had an influence in the early part of our history, first before the country was founded, and then even after the country began to have a constitutional republic. These religious groups were very instrumental, weren't they?
That's right. I mean, one question that interested me going into this project is, you know, in our current moment, when you hear the phrase charismatic Christianity, I think many American Christians think of Pentecostals, and they think of speaking in tongues and faith healing. But going up all the way through the 4 centuries of our country's history since European contact, Christians have experimented with and opened themselves up to the Holy Spirit in a whole range of ways. And groups were speaking in tongues long before the famous revivals that launched the great modern Pentecostal movement at the turn of the 20th century. Early Mormons spoke in tongues. Shakers spoke in tongues, often believing that they were receiving the gift to speak in indigenous languages because they were so focused on evangelizing among Native Americans. But I was also really interested in this explosion of religious experimentation in this kind of religious free market. What makes colonial America so special is the relatively loose hold that old world religious institutions had, and the relative degree of freedom that people had to really depart in significant ways from Christian orthodoxy. And it's that early period I call the era of the prophets. And these are all figures who really define their message against institutions and thrive because I think Americans are really searching for a way to organize life in this new country where the models of the old world don't perfectly work.
And I just mentioned, too, that we'll get to that a little bit later in your last chapter on revival, but whether you're talking about the Azusa Street revival, Catherine Coleman, or whether you're talking about Amy Semple McPherson, and some of the things you identify with Pentecostalism, you have some of the elements of that, as you mentioned, with the Shakers and a variety of others. And it's just, I think, a good illustration of the fact that reaction there over time was something that was, again, trying to understand what mainstream religion would look like in America. You had the First Great Awakening, you had the Second Great Awakening, of course, you had the American Revolution in between, and that is the case. But let's, if we can, maybe talk about some of the other individuals that were probably best known for their political action, and that would be, of course, whether it's Harrison or Jackson or a variety of others. These were individuals who were leaders that were bringing a different kind of charisma, but a political charisma into the conversation, weren't they?
That's right. In the book, I try to talk about figures who were really large in American history, as well as characters who are probably going to be less familiar to readers. And one pattern I noticed among some of those political figures who are more familiar, George Washington, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, that these were figures who were very savvy at kind of reading the dominant charismatic style of their age. In each period of history, a particular kind of charismatic storytelling, I think, became really resonant with Americans. A particular approach to the anxieties and fears and desires of that period. And so you see a lot of figures kind of leaning hard into that, but often their movement is kind of an efflorescence, a brief flaring up that then dissipates. But the leaders who really managed to enact their vision in a lasting way in institutions responded more strategically. So I was really interested in tracking the responses of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the dynamics of his time. He comes into office with fireside chats that emphasize reason and beckon Americans to really be rational and calm and turn over their concerns about the chaos of the Great Depression to experts. But a little later on, when he starts encountering a serious populist challenge on his left, most famously in the form of the Louisiana politician Huey Long.
Huey Long, yeah.
He tacks left, and he pulls out his populist side, and his technocrat, brain trust advisors are kind of looking on in horror in Madison Square Garden as they hear, their boss sounding like a demagogue. But he knows how to kind of turn that on strategically in a way that did deflate the threat to his left and enabled him to continue his hold on power. And I see that kind of nimbleness appear again and again in the more institutionally successful political leaders.
And again, it gets back to some of those key words. You asked somebody, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. John F. Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Try off the top of your head to mention the famous line from Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, it becomes a little more difficult, Calvin Coolidge, whatever it might be. You can see that these were individuals that understood the value of language. They used the medium that they had at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course, the fireside chats with radio. Of course, we can talk about the fact that if you listen to the debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, you think Nixon did pretty well. Matter of fact, you might even thought he won. If you watched it on TV, of course, John F. Kennedy understood only so well that it was a visual medium. So in some respects, it's just an illustration, again, about, as your subtitle says, how charisma shaped the American history, and certain individuals understanding that were more effective than others, weren't they?
Yeah, your point about those memorable slogans is, I think, a really helpful one, because if we think about why those slogans stick with us and were so effective, I think they summarize how each of those presidents invited Americans into a new story about what America could become, how the country could weather and transcend the current crisis. And it was a story that asked Americans to play an active role. And I think that's the heart of charisma. That is the through line that is common to all the figures I write about. It's that they don't just, spin off a set of attractive policy proposals or neat slogans, but rather they offer you a new kind of plot line of what this country is going to be. And they invite some people into the story, and then they cast others as villains, or they leave other people out or make them feel left out. And I think our reaction to leaders hinges on whether we feel invited into the story they're telling, or we see ourselves on the outside and feel threatened by it.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into some of the social movements. Obviously, we can talk about the abolition movement and how that was tied in maybe to the Second Great Awakening. Certainly, the civil rights movement is that as well. And one whole section here when you talk about intellect, we've talked about this before, sort of the anti-science ideas and how some of that surfaced as well, and some of the anti-demagoguery and just a whole lot of other issues that are part of this book called Spellbound. If you would like to know a little bit more about Dr. Molly Worthen, we have a link to her website, and that gives you information about her and her book, and perhaps you would like to have her come and speak on her resources there, or maybe learn a little bit more about some of the other material that she's posted. It lists a number of her articles, especially one called Charisma Rules the World, and some other ones, The Fastest Growing Christian Group Reveals About America, and just a number of other things that you might want to find out about her. So that's available at the website. We also have a link to the book itself, and if you wanted to get it either in Kindle or hardcover, that is available as well. So go to the website pointofview.net, and also we have posted some articles from our first hour in which you might want to find some of those and utilize those in your own research as well. Book is entitled Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. Yes, we'll get to Donald Trump sooner or later. And I hope that you will continue to join us as we get into some other aspects of history, looking at it through maybe a different lens than we've ever looked at it before. We'll be back right after these important messages.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Molly Worthen, again, professor of history, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, author of this book, Spellbound. I might also mention, again, the history of Christianity in her Great Courses series that you might want to obtain. But Molly, I thought for just a minute we might focus on Pentecost, but maybe a little different look than people would ever know, because when you talk about, again, the Azusa Street revival, when you talk about the whole Pentecostal movement, there's another aspect of that. And I like to say, before there was a Martin Luther King Jr., there was a Marcus Garvey. And even before that, there was, of course, an abolition movement, and there was a movement to really address some of those issues. But Marcus Garvey actually was addressing the issue of the African-American circumstance. And in some respects, you can't really understand the civil rights movement either in the early part of the 20th century, or certainly when then Martin Luther King Jr. comes on the scene later on, without understanding the religious connection, can you?
That's right. I mean, this prehistory in the first few decades of the 20th century is so important, and it's a little unusual to talk about the Black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey, who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, alongside the Azusa Street Revival, the 1906 explosion of modern Pentecostalism. But I really think they are intimately connected, and they're both movements that really cut against the grain of white domination of kind of the institutions of power, and that includes many of the churches. And I think the fact that those early Pentecostal revivals were full of, I mean, this is happening in Los Angeles, right? So it's a very ethnically and racially diverse city. So there are Black people and Latinos and Chinese immigrants worshiping alongside, people of European descent. And much of what was so outrageous about those early revivals to outsiders was the flagrant violation of racial taboos. And one of the major leaders was a Black preacher named William Seymour, who sensed this hunger among people of all colors for a contact with raw divine power, I think, and a sense that the kind of modern age of technology and promises about science kind of solving all problems, and the growth of bureaucracy, which was something that Americans were feeling, I think, across all parts of their lives, that all of this would produce a kind of utopia that really felt like a raw deal. I mean, especially to Black Americans, but by the time the Great Depression was underway, I think it felt that way to all Americans. And so I call this period in my history of charismatic leaders the age of the agitators. And these agitator figures are kind of prophetic voices who criticize that promise of science and reason and modernity and yes. bureaucracy. And Marcus Garvey, I mean, he has his kind of own spiritual take. I mean, he kind of mixed different elements of Christianity, but he had this broader narrative of, calling people of African descent to seize their divine destiny and really claim the story that God wanted for them. And in the aftermath of his movement, after he's been arrested and deported, and it seems like his Black nationalist movement is kind of petering out, historians have found that there's an interesting mingling, especially in the South, between chapters of the UNIA, his organization, and these growing upstart Pentecostal churches. There is a kind of common thread that I think reflects a more universal human hunger for divine power and for a feeling that we are simultaneously in control in some way, but not all the way. We're I think afraid as humans. We're afraid of total responsibility for our destiny, and we want the security of knowing we're part of a bigger story, and there is a bigger power, a supernatural power in charge of it all.
One of the things I want to get to in just a minute is the apocalypse, but before we do that, let's stay on the Enlightenment part, because you begin with Max Weber and, of course, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and this idea that we really do need to understand that the success of America and the success of the free market really came back to a view of Protestantism and this work ethic, which was identified. And then when that began to unfold, we'll get to the apocalypse in just a minute, with the Great Depression, then you started having all sorts of doomsayers. But talk about that for just a minute, because that comes, interestingly enough, from an individual that wasn't all that religious, but nevertheless writes about the connection between a Christian view and an economic foundation.
Yeah, you can't talk about charisma without talking about Max Weber, because he's really the one who invented the meaning of the word as we use it in everyday conversation. Mm-hmm. Before he borrowed it from the context of Scripture and church history in the first decade of the 20th century and applied it to a particular kind of political authority, it was an obscure theological term. But I think he saw a need for some way to describe a kind of authority that is distinct from the authority that comes with an institutional position or military power or tradition, a kind of wild X factor. And you're right. I mean, he was really beginning to develop this idea through his study of Puritan colonial American religion and its relationship to early capitalism. And he observed the way in which the theological framework that the Puritans brought to this country, this sense that they were predestined, that God elects people for salvation before the beginning of time, but that even if you don't earn your salvation, the evidence of your elect status ought to show up in the fruits of your life. That expectation, Weber said, fed a priority on seeing your worldly vocation in a certain way and judging a certain kind of worldly success in theological terms. And I think Weber is one of my heroes because, I mean, even though, as you say, he himself was not religious, he famously called himself religiously unmusical. This is how I felt, frankly, for much of my own life. Like, yes. I'm fascinated by this, but I can't quite get the beat. I'm tone deaf in this key way. I think that's how Weber felt.
Yes.
But he took religion really seriously. And as much as he was, I think, a fan of modern, liberal Western democracy and what he saw happening, he was also worried. He was worried about the dehumanizing side of growing bureaucracies and strengthening institutions. And when he writes about charismatic leaders, you sense this kind of ambivalence, this way in which he's a little afraid of these prophetic, wild, supernaturally empowered figures, but he also sees them as crucial disruptors in what he called the iron cage of modernity.
Yes. Well, just fascinating material there, and we're coming to a break, but I thought maybe we'd just set up the fact that is kind of the foundation for a belief, really, that as we come into the 20th century, there would be a great unfolding of some of the science and technology and the rest. We have World War I, we have the Great Depression, and again, maybe when we come back from the break, we can talk about some of the doomsayers, because that gets you into everything from Huey Long and, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but also Amy Semple McPherson, even some of the individuals today that are producing kind of a doomsayer kind of mindset. So I do want to get into that. And then we'll also mention that there's a whole section on the experts and gurus, but of course you even have near the end, and we'll certainly try to cover that, the section on, of all people, Donald Trump, to give that some perspectives there as well. So it's all part of this book, which is entitled Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. It has an opening section on prophets that deal with revolution and awakenings and wartime, conquerors, mastery, visions, and attraction. The ones we've been talking about right now, agitators, that would be, of course, the Enlightenment, Pentecost, Apocalypse, which we'll come back and talk about, the experts, which get us into intellect and liberation breakdown, and then finally what we've already sort of mentioned in passing, but we'll come back to again, all of the gurus that are part of that as well. And it's just a fascinating issue of how some of this has unfolded right before our very eyes. We are certainly living through many of these experiences. If we look back over history, we can certainly see some evidence of this as well. And this tries to span a number of centuries and help us maybe get a little better understanding of how the story of charisma in America reveals, in some respects, some of the failures of religious institutions, as well as the promise of a meaningful life. We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Molly Worthen with us. Spellbound is the book, and again, we have information about it on our website at pointofview.net. And at one point, you talk about what was happening at the turn of the last century, and during the 1920s, you say black Americans knew better than anyone the feelings of helplessness and despair. But now, in the Great Depression, those sentiments resonated among working and middle-class Americans of all colors. To them, Huey Long was no longer a demagogue. He was a prophet with plans. plans. And a few days later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then the governor of New York, leaned into a microphone in the study of the Executive Mansion in Albany to give a 10-minute speech on the Lucky Strike hour. And again, you can see there was this concern of apocalypse and also the idea that we need to change direction. And yet, of course, we have seen throughout our history so many times in which we've had doomsayers, haven't we?
I think it's a way of addressing a feeling of crisis that resonates pretty reliably. I mean, if you're a Christian, and Christianity has been the dominant frame for most Americans for 4+ centuries, it's the ultimate story. It's the ultimate expectation of justice and rectification and the end of suffering. And one thing that charismatic leaders in general do, and the apocalyptic tradition in Christianity has a rich vein of this, is to pull back the veil and say, you've been given this one picture of reality. Maybe the experts affiliated with the big institutions of our public life have told you what it means, but I'm here to tell you that if you can crack the code, you can actually see what's truly going on, and you can see the future. And a whole range of end times prophets have gone to the Bible, and the more esoteric and hard to interpret, vivid symbolism, especially in the Book of Revelation, to do just that. But I think it's a broader tradition and a rhetorical style that honors the feeling that so many of us have now, that the current order is falling apart and we really don't know what's coming next. And you see that in both more secular expressions, and so certainly in the context of the Great Depression, Huey Long, who was offering a much more radical economic proposal than FDR, was doing that. But in some ways, he's the secular foil for a more, an explicitly Christian preacher like the Pentecostal evangelist Aimee Semple McPherson, who very much believed that the second coming was right around the corner, and painted vivid images for her followers of what this would look like.
Well, again, one of the things I appreciate about that is so often we separate the religious from the political. And 1 minute in this chapter, you're talking about Huey Long. Next minute, you're talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The next minute, you're talking about Aimee Semple McPherson. And all of that rolls together. But while we're talking about the apocalypse, you really can't understand, I would think, the rise of Ronald Reagan unless you look at Jimmy Carter and the Malays. And, of course, Ronald Reagan saying it's morning again in America. And that kind of revival. And now, if certainly, I think some people want to say, okay, what are you going to say about Donald Trump? Well, again, if you cannot understand how, in some respects, that populist message works without understanding that he came and said, there are too many people coming over the border and they're not the right kind of people. We're getting ripped off by other countries because we don't have tariffs. And in some respects, that resonated again with the American people. So in both of those cases, you can see that arising out of that kind of doom and sense of maybe malaise was a more thoughtful and optimistic message that connected with the American people.
I think that's right. And the other crucial dynamic of our current moment is the weakness of established institutions. I mean, in many ways, my book is a story about the erosion of American trust in and faith in established institutions, ranging from their trust in federal government to how they view universities, mainstream media, even the military, you name it. I mean, when we go back and look at the poll data, 1958, 3/4 of Americans said that they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. You fast forward to our own time, that number is more like 22%. It's a little bit lower for Republicans, a little bit higher for Democrats. And so I think there is a way in which charismatic figures throughout our history, most of them they've always criticized institutions, stood outside the establishment and lobbed verbal grenades. But there's a way in which, in the past, Americans had a bit more faith in those institutions to really hold up society and provide a true story of the world. I think we're in a place now where, in the fact that fewer and fewer Americans go to church, it's part of a bigger story. We affiliate with institutions on a lower rate of participation across the board, not just religious institutions. And so I think Donald Trump's message that these institutions have failed you, that these people with power, these experts, they are presenting you with a view of the world that does not line up with your experience, that resonated deeply with a large swath of Americans.
Yes. David Brooks just wrote about that recently, and that we aren't going to various institutions. But then I saw Noah Rothman saying, yeah, but that's only part of the story. It used to be that we went to places where you would have both a doctor and a plumber in the same meeting, and now they're going to more of these separated ones. So it gets back to that polarization. But you're right. We used to be a nation of joiners, and now we're bowling alone, to use the title of one of those books. So anyway, it's just a fascinating look at that. But let me, just before we let you go, talk about the fact that we do have a link to your website, mollyworthen.com. People can, of course, find out about any one of your books, but you also have articles, various opportunities for people to read those articles and maybe see some of the media. But there's also a contact place where if somebody might want to have you come and speak, or they'd like to get on your mailing list, they could do that as well. And I've appreciated your work as a journalist and as a teacher of the history of Christianity, and certainly appreciated this book and the time you gave to us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to, of course, take a break, and then tomorrow we will get into some more issues. I'm hoping that we might be able, after we go off the air here in just a few minutes, do an interview and a taping with Senator James Langford, who is the senator from the state of Oklahoma. And if that's the case, we'll play that tomorrow. If we don't connect up with him, we have, of course, quite a bit to cover as well. But as I have mentioned just a few minutes ago, we've got all sorts of resources that are available to you today. And so if you wanted to know a little bit more about the issue of artificial intelligence and the chatbots, we've got that piece by John Lott. We also have information about this issue of transgenderism and kind of the issue unfolding right now in Loudoun County, Virginia. And, of course, a piece about mail-in balloting, to mention just a few. But there will be many other topics we will need to address certainly every single day. And if we don't get to some of those tomorrow, we certainly will get to them on our Friday weekend edition. So one last time, let me encourage you, go to the website. You'll find my commentary, viewpoints, AI and jobs. If you've never seen that before, I would recommend it. We have some of the articles as well as information about Dr. Molly Worthen and the book called Spellbound. And, of course, as we've mentioned before, we have our $10 campaign. So if you'd like to chip in $10, I would certainly appreciate that. Just your way of saying, I've been paying attention to what you're doing, like what you're doing, and I certainly could send you a $10 bill and certainly support this ministry. That's all we have for today. We look forward to joining you tomorrow. And thank you again to Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Visit the website pointofview.net, and we'll be back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Point of View began all the way back in 1973 as a listener-supported ministry, and we are still a listener-supported ministry. But out of the hundreds of thousands of Point of View listeners, just 1% donate to keep the program going. Imagine what would happen, how many people we could reach together if the 99% stepped up to donate as well. It doesn't take much to make a difference. In fact, we've done the numbers, and if every listener gave $10, Point of View would be funded for an entire year. If you're in the 99%, why not join the team of listeners who make Point of View a reality for everyone else? Chip in your $10 today. You can give online at pointofview.net. Or you can use your phone and call right now at 1-800-347-5151. Again, that's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.